our personality, and it affects the way that our behave. So today I would like to we will talk about culture, but in a new perspective. It's from mainstream perspective, and that's why Jim Kelman is here with us today to talk about how culture affects our personality. So can you give an applause for Jim's being here today? Thank you. So to start off, I would like to show you a video, just a short one. Uh, it shows us about how different, like how culture affects can can result in different reaction, and it's about food. Southeast Asia. Do you know what kind of food?
Rồi lại là biết ngủ đi.
Oh.
We know what Danny's going to bring next week.
What? I would love that, but it will. I would love that, but it will.
So that leaves the stage to Jim Kelman.
Wait a minute, you use that to introduce me?
I hope you guys enjoy it.
Well, I'm going to hopefully bring this to a slightly higher level. Seriously, I see people here of all ages, and I'm going to challenge every one of you to follow me, and think through what I'm saying, and to figure out how it applies to you. I'm an American guy. I was born here. My parents were born here. 3 of my 4 grandparents were born here, and none of my great-grandparents were born here. My family came from Russia, Belarus, Lithuania, Poland. Let me tell you a story to begin with. There was a little girl, young girl, who was about 8 years old, 9 years old, and American girl, and she would often go out with her grandfather. Her grandfather was a very dignified-looking guy with very beard and a mustache, who wore a suit all the time, and he spoke English with a very thick accent, because he was born somewhere else. And this little girl told me that she was sometimes ashamed of her grandfather, ashamed of the way that he spoke, and didn't always want to introduce him to her friends. And as time went by, as her grandfather got older and he suffered from what we now recognize as Alzheimer's, early Alzheimer's, she became even more uncomfortable sometimes with this old man who spoke English in a funny way. Well, as usually why I thought about this, that little girl, by the way, is my father. Grandfather, my great-grandfather, who came from Poland. And as someone who has spent more than 35 years sort of moving in and out of various Asian cultures to varying degrees, but always coming back to my own culture. Let me share just some ideas with you. And as I say, these ideas, some of them are going to be a little bit difficult to grasp, but I want you to get what you can and apply it as much as you can to yourself. Let's start off with American culture, because I know that best. And I'll speak a little bit about American culture, but Western culture, meaning European, the cultures that, white people, okay? Because the original cultural influences in this country came from Europe, originally. Not, the country looks very different now, as we can see. Almost everybody in this room is an American. And Americans look like me, but they also look like all of you, and a lot of other people too. But anybody who's grown up here will understand and remember what we were taught about our revolution, the American Revolution. What was it that we were seeking? We were seeking a government that would protect our rights, our liberties, and our freedoms. And we fought for it. We fought for it against the British, and despite some very difficult odds, we won our freedom. And as a result, the highest and most strongly held American values are the values which describes the relationship between the government and the people, society and the people. Society in this country is designed to protect and defend the rights, liberties, and freedoms of the individuals. And we're proud of it. And everything that we do and everything that we are kind of reflects that as Americans. And Sarah, Christina, today. And so, as Americans, those are the values that we hold strong. And every one of you who was born here and who's growing up here or who went to school here understands that. But there are other cultures and other values that are taught elsewhere as well. And in many Asian countries, especially countries that are Confucian-based, with a hierarchy in the society, things are a little bit different. And they're not readily apparent to either, just by looking. You have to dig deeper before you can understand this. In many Asian countries, the rights, the liberties, and the freedoms of the individual are expected to be subordinate to the requirements of the society and the needs of the society. And even if you weren't born into that, even if you were born here, chances are your parents or your grandparents were born into a society that reflects those values. And those values are a little bit different. You are taught in many Asian cultures that what you want for yourself is all well and good, but what society needs from you is actually more important. And people tend to accept that and go on with their lives. Now, these are two very different narratives, very different views of the relationship between the society and its people. And again, a casual visitor to the United States or Western Europe or a casual visitor to Asia cannot see this on the surface because it's not on the surface, it's in here. It's in here. It's who we are. It's how we look at ourselves. It's how we look at our bigger life. Yes.
So to be short, can you name some of the characteristics that is different from between American and?
I'll get to that. And I'm not speaking only of Americans and Vietnamese, but I am speaking of Americans and Vietnamese also. So far, is everybody with me? Get it? Okay. So as a result of this type of thinking, many Vietnamese, many Asian Americans will look at mainstream Americans, I guess that's the true use here, white Americans, as selfish. Think of us as selfish. They think of us as self-centered. And they think of us as pursuing only our own goals and not caring that much about the goals of society, the goals of even our families, or the goals of those around us with whom we identify. And many Asians will look down on us, Americans, because of that. They figure these people have no culture. They have no respect for, for their society. They have no respect for their elders, or little respect for their elders. And many Americans will look at Asians as being very narrow, not having the ability to think independently for themselves, and in some cases, and we'll get to some of these other elements, submissive or just narrowly focused. They're wrong. Everybody's wrong about this. Because we are all influenced by those around us, those we love, those we fear, and those we respect. And so any of these, and that's why they call them stereotypes. They're called stereotypes because they are maybe commonly held thoughts, but they're not necessarily accurate thoughts. As a result of this, many Asians tend to collaborate with each other within a group and to work together within a group, not always harmoniously, because anybody who has worked with, take your pick, Vietnamese, Chinese, Malaysians, Japanese, will know, Cambodians, Thai, will know that if you get 5 people of one ethnic group in a room, you're going to have 7 or 8 opinions right away, and they're all going to be conflicting with each other. But Asians tend, I believe, to feel more comfortable collaborating with each other, whereas Americans tend, and again, I'm wandering into dangerous territory here, to be more individualistic in their approach to things. And just look at the symbols of American life, the cowboy on the range, the lone cowboy out doing what he knows he has to do by himself, being a rugged individualist who doesn't take any guff from anybody else outside. He gets the job done. He is proud of what he does at the end of the day. And that's the symbol that Americans have had for themselves, whether knowingly or unknowingly, since our pioneer days.
Can I ask you a question?
Please.
So, based on your experience working with both Asians and Americans, and as you have noticed, like Asians tend to work collaboratively, and the American tends to work alone. So, how is it different in the way you treat them, in the way you work with them?
I think one of the wonderful things about a society like ours that accepts, not only tolerates, but accepts and welcomes everybody, is that we have the ability to learn from everybody. And we have the ability to learn from the experiences of others. And that's really the true nature of our society. And that which we see, if we're smart, we will adopt what's called, everybody know the term best practices? Best practices is a business term, which means that there are many different ways of doing things, but there are ways that have been established to be the best ways of doing things. And those are the ways that you should tend to adopt to apply to whatever challenge you have, the best practice. And we can learn a lot of best practices from each other in the approaches that we take, if we're smart enough, and if we have our eyes, our minds, and our hearts open to them. And so that's my answer. There isn't a right way, there isn't a wrong way. There are only best practices, the most efficient ways. Many Asians feel a strong sense of obligation to their families, obligation to their elders, obligation to those that have helped them and those that have helped to bring them to where they are. Americans feel obligation also, and we often express it in different ways. Again, we're more individualistic about how we express ourselves. We're more individualistic about how we conduct our affairs. And again, the rugged individualist is our hero. The cowboy on the plains is our hero, rather than the person in the tightly knit group of collaborators who are, in fact, in popular American culture, often people sitting together in a tight circle planning something often has a negative implication. They're plotting something, planning something. Couldn't be good. You know, we need to rise above that, and that's very subtle in our culture and in our popular culture. But for an Asian American, collaboration is natural. You're part of a society. You're part of a tight-knit, close society, whether it's by linguistic group, less so by religion, but also by family and national origin. I'm aware of a group of Vietnamese students at a local community college who met often and regularly in the library. And they would help each other with their homework, and they would discuss things of interest to everybody. And it so happens I knew somebody who worked in that library, the outsider. I said, hey, what do you do? You know, I know some people, in fact, they're the Vietnamese Students Association of the school, and they meet in the library. Do you see them? Oh, yeah. She said, I see them often. They seem to be very close and very closed. They don't seem to let anybody else in with them. They seem to be really supportive of each other and kind of exclusive. But these are two different views of the same thing. And, you know, one from the inside group and another from someone outside who's looking at them from outside, who's not in that in-group. In-group and out-group is also a very important concept. And we've seen it in history, and we've seen it in history played out in ways that are really unfortunate. In Nazi Germany, if you were an Auslander, outsider, then that basically gave the mainstream, the Nazis, pretty much license to do whatever they wanted to. And we saw history has taught us what happens when a society thinks of itself as insiders and outsiders. Another country that has done that, and another culture that has done that to tragic historical proportions, were the Japanese, also during World War II. You were either in the in-group, in which case you were revered, loved, and respected, or you were in the out-group, where anything goes. And whether it's current movies that we're seeing now about how Japanese have treated Western and American prisoners, to history that's very difficult to uncover. What Japanese did in the name of this culture, this cultural attitude, in-group, out-group, they were held to account in a war crimes setting for their actions, as were the Germans. So it's not only Asians that think like this, but it can be Westerners also. It's a very dangerous way of thought. In our country and in our society, our strength is our inclusiveness and how we adopt and adapt to each other, what we learn from each other, how we promote our common goals based on the differences that go into formulating them. That's our strength. Others around the world consider that to be a weakness in human rights. I disagree. The fact that we are all here pursuing our common future together, to me, is an example of the strength of our diversity. Diversity does not cause weakness. diversity causes strength.
I have a question. So you say diversity is a strength. So it's important to like adopt and adapt, as you say. So back to the story at the library, you tell, as the librarian says, most of the Vietnamese students just want to stick together and would not, and she has a feeling that they wouldn't let her in that group.
Well, for one thing, she was in a different generation.
Yeah, I know, but let's say like another American student, and they see like a group of Vietnamese students speaking their language, doing their own work, and they feel like they don't want to interrupt it, and they don't want.
That was her impression, yes. Whether that was true or not, I don't know. Only the people who were in that group would really know.
Yeah. So how can we project ourselves in a way that they feel welcome, and we can also work with each other?
Well, being welcoming to others is a human characteristic. It's a human trait. That's how we form our relationships. That's how we form our associations. That's how we form our clubs and our groups. And it's natural. We all have it within us to do this. The question is, when do we do it? How do we do it? Under what circumstances do we do it? Whatever humans do with each other, whether consciously or unconsciously, there's always a cost-benefit analysis that they do, or eventually do, maybe not very young people, but older people say, if I do this, what's it going to cost me? Not necessarily in terms of money, but what's it going to cost me in terms of myself? What am I going to have to give of myself? And in return, what am I going to gain? So is it worth it for me to expend whatever it is, and again, we're not talking money here, in order to gain whatever it is? And this is usually a process that we don't even understand, we don't even think that we're doing as we're doing it, but often we're doing it. And the older we get, the more we do it. The younger we are, the less we do it, because we don't necessarily think of the world in those terms. And again, this is not cultural, this is human. So those of us who have the blessing to live in this culture, we should always have our hearts and our minds open to others, because that's who we are. That's who we are as people, that's who we are as Americans, and that's who we are as mainstream Americans, Asian Americans, African Americans, Arab Americans. That's who we are. And that's what causes us to be strong society that we are. And so this is something that's I would say it's a requirement, but it's certainly a obligation that we should all feel to ourselves. Even though very often, we form our friendships, we form our associations based on a number of things, culture being one of them, but not only. For example, there's some kids I know who love, let's say, K-pop music, just to choose and there might be a lot of other kids who like K-pop music too, who are not necessarily in the same culture. And what binds them together? K-pop. In fact, there might be one or two of them sitting around here. But there are other things also. There's mathematics. Some kids love math, surprisingly. For kids who love math, they're going to get together. Some kids love literature. Some kids like auto mechanics. Whatever it is, these natural human tendencies cross cultural lines, and they bring us together. They serve as elements that bring us together rather than separate us. So that's I think that's an element of culture, but also of humanity. There are a couple of interesting questions that I'd like to that have been raised that I'd like to try to answer. One of them: most Americans think Vietnamese and Asians in general are submissive. Can you explain the role of culture in shaping Asians' personality traits and behavior? submissive to who? Submissive to what? In order to be submissive, somebody else has to be dominant. Personally, I don't think Asians are submissive. I think Asians are respectful, because this is what Asians are taught within Asian culture, all Asian cultures. And being respectful also means being quiet. I mean, how many times did my parents tell me, you know, children should be seen and not heard? I heard it so much that by the time I was about 25, I actually started paying attention to it. But not much when I was younger. But Asian kids, when they're told you should be seen but not heard, tend to take that more seriously. Is that submissiveness? No, I don't think so. It's respect. And many Americans confuse respectful also for submission. So, do I agree with that? No. Again, this is from my cultural perspective. Asians are hardworking and smart. They are loyal employees. Some common careers of them are doctors, engineers, nurses. Quiet. However, this does not apply to all Asians. What do you think about this stereotype? And how does it affect working relationship? Yeah, Asian Americans are smart and hardworking, and so are white Americans and black Americans and Arab Americans and Spanish Americans. And guess what? There's some Asian Americans who are not particularly smart, not particularly hardworking, just like everybody else. Again, that's a stereotype. Again, often it's based on the fact that Asians tend to grow up in families and in societies that require and demand respect along hierarchical lines. Very simple. If you're younger, you respect those that are older than you. And this respect and this acknowledgement of the hierarchies in the Asian society is built right into the language. How many of you here speak Vietnamese? Okay. Right in the Vietnamese language, there are, as you're addressing somebody, you're addressing them as an older brother, younger sister, cousin, auntie. And in the workplace, I'm not sure if it's true in Vietnamese society, but do you also address people by their professional title as well? Okay, and that's true in most Asian languages. And it's certainly true in Korean, a language I know a little bit about. It's certainly true in Japanese, a language which I speak a little bit. And I'm the director of a Korean American Youth Exchange program. And how many of these Korean college kids come up to me and call me Director Kelman? One American would call somebody like that. But that immediately sets out the hierarchy. And what that means is that even if you're only a couple of years apart, even built into the language, there's that degree of who you are relative to who somebody else is. And that's something that's so ingrained in so many Asian cultures, you don't even think about it, but it's there. It's there in the way that you speak, it's there in the way that you think. One of the things that I tell some of my Korean kids is that I've got a really good friend. He's a little bit older than me. He's somebody that I worked with at the State Department for years. I really respect that we hang out together, we hike together, we drink beer together, we confide in each other, we complain about our lives to each other, and we generally are as close as any two guys can be. And people understand that. But when I explain how it is that I first met this guy, that's when people's jaws drop. He was my boss. And that's completely inconceivable, Peter. And that's completely inconceivable in so many Asian cultures that you could become friends with someone who started off as your boss. Just because of the hierarchy that's built into the relationship, even before the relationship starts, really.
So I have a question. So So you say about hierarchy, and you say that Asians, sometimes they use position in the way they talk to each other too. So that's why a lot of parents would love their children to have like prestigious jobs, such as teachers or doctor, engineer, and such. And it might, to me, it might limit the potential of the kids.
I
right?
agree 100%.
But for the Western culture, like, because it was an individualistic culture, so the parents somehow they tend to respect the kids' opinions. So as a Vietnamese American, and we live in American, how can we speak to our parents in such a way that they can respect our opinions, but also not be perceived to be rude?
Get a medical degree. No, seriously, this is something that's a great question. Everybody hear the question? Understand the question? It's a great question. How can we earn the respect of our parents as children? First thing you got to do is reach early adulthood, I think, and prove to your parents that your thoughts and your feelings and your actions and your abilities are valuable. And it probably also helps to let them know every way that you can, both directly and especially indirectly, that they came from them. That you are who you are because they are who they are, and they help to make you who you are. Never underestimate the value of flattery, even to your own parents. Especially important if it's true. Especially important if it has the added advantage of being true. Then it's completely unassailable. You know, let your parents know that you are who you are, whether you're a success or on your way to becoming a success, because of their influence on you. And then they will begin to respect your opinion more because they know that it came from them. And now this may not always work, and again, I'm putting my cultural perspective on it, but let me give you an illustrative story about this. There was a family that I knew very well. The son was one of my best friends. The parents were Holocaust survivors from Poland, Polish Jews who somehow managed to survive the Holocaust. And it's a chilling story, and I'll tell you sometime, because I heard it directly from them. They're no longer living. And my friend Henry graduated somehow from college and got a job in the insurance industry in Hartford, Connecticut, where we grew up. And that's Hartford is a company town. It's the insurance industry. A number of different companies there, at least there were 30, 25 years ago. And Henry started off in the insurance services industry. He was doing public relations for an insurance company, helping to design public affairs strategies to promote individual agents. I think it was the Hartford he was working for, a big company. And his parents, his dad was trained as a chemist in Kelman before World War II. But before he was thrown into the Birkenau concentration camp and taken every bit of his humanity stripped away from him, he managed to survive. Again, a chilling story. Met Henry's mom in the concentration camp. She managed to survive too. Chilling story. And they married, had Henry and Steve, immigrated to the United States, where their name was Zweibaum. Mr. Z, as I called him, got a job initially with a local distillery in Hartford called Highball, pronounced Hublot also. But he couldn't catch it because of language. His qualifications were fine, but he couldn't communicate well enough with other co-workers. And he quit that job and opened up a dry cleaning company. Dry cleaners still exist today in Hartford. It's got to be the only dry cleaner in the country that's owned by somebody who's not Korean. Another great stereotype. And after Henry had been working for the insurance company for about 5 or 6 years and doing pretty well, he decided that he was going to quit. And he was going to use all of his skills and talents to help grow his family's business. And, buy new properties and open new dry cleaning stores and market their products in different ways. And I was over for dinner one night, which I was over for dinner almost every night. And Mr. Z and Mrs. Z, they spoke English with a thick accent like this, you could hardly understand them. Jimmy, they said, what is Henry doing? How is he thinking? This is how his wife spoke. And that's after having been in the United States for 35 years. What is he, I won't do the accent, but, what is he thinking? I said, Mr. Z, what he's trying to do is to show his respect and regard for you and your wife and his mom and help you with your business. You're getting older, he doesn't want you to work that. But he has such a good job. Yeah, he has a good job, but he feels that he's going to contribute more to the family by quitting the job and working with you. And this goes right to something you said a few minutes ago, which made me think of this. He said, Jimmy, how can he do it? He wears a suit to work every day. That was his definition of success. A guy who wears a suit to work every day is a successful guy. Not necessarily a doctor or an engineer. Somebody who wears a suit to work every day. And he's going to come to work in jeans and a t-shirt because look at our factory, look at our shop. So that's not the important thing. The important thing is that he wants to join with his family to make the family's life easier. And that's the story. He wears a suit every day. How can he do this? But there's a lot of values in that story that are not Asian values.
So I have a question. So based on your story, and because you mentioned the accent, and as I did my survey with some of the students here in Success, and they say communication is very important, and language barrier is one of the barriers that prevents Vietnamese student from talking and mingling with others, Americans. So what do you think? As an American, and you see someone speak Vietnamese accent English, what do you think about them? And does it affect the way that you treat them? Affect the way that you perceive them?
In my case, no. But I can't speak for all Americans. Many native speakers of English, and not just white Americans, but they can be Asian Americans also, have less patience for people who don't speak English as well as they do, as quickly as they do, as fast as they do, as colloquially as they do. Something will pop into their head, FOB, something like that. Fresh off the boat, they're not where we are. Just remember that language is used not as a barrier, but language is used primarily as a way to bring people together. So that's the challenge of everybody who doesn't speak English as a native speaker. To use the language as a way to connect, not a way to separate. And look, there's very little that you can do to get into people's heads who already have a fixed opinion. But there are things that you can do. And that has to do with other non-verbal forms of communication. Your body language, your professional comportment, the way that you present yourselves to others. If you present yourself to others in an open way, in an accessible way, that will go a long way in helping to bridge possible barriers that might be caused by language. But one of the things that I tell my Korean students is there are two elements to being successful here in this country, even for a temporary period. One is your ability to speak, understand, read, and write English well, and the other is your personal flexibility. And so those two go together. If You need to be sometimes more flexible in your thinking and in your actions if you, especially if you're not a native speaker of English. One other question that I was asked here, and that's Asians do not usually speak up their minds and tend to be conservative. They tend to hang out with other Asians rather than mingling with Americans. What do you think? Explain the advantage or disadvantage. Well, we talked about that a little bit, but the only unasked question, the only stupid question, is the question that's never asked. Have you heard that before? You've probably all heard it, and if you haven't, if you're hearing it here for the first time, it won't be the last time. Speaking up, especially in this society, whether you realize it or not, whether you realize it now or not, is a key to how you're going to be successful in this country. Most Asian kids in most Asian classrooms, you're sitting here like this quietly, I'm standing here like this, blabbering on, and generally, even if you have questions, you don't ask. Now, what Nguyen was doing was exactly what American kids are taught to do. Raise your hand and interrupt in the middle of the thought, in the middle of what the teacher is saying or doing. A lot of Asian kids won't do that. Why? Because, again, it violates the time-honored precept, the time-honored idea that the teacher is the honored person in the room and the student is just somewhere down here or low. And the American education is very different. The teacher here is a guide. The teacher in the classroom is a guide. And the students have an obligation to learn. The teacher has an obligation to teach, but that's not a one-way street. So what Nguyen was doing reflects her understanding of American culture that you would probably never do that in Vietnam, right? At the Vietnamese classroom? No, not at all. And why would you do it here? Because you understand that that's expected and even required. And if you want, if there's something that you need to learn or something you want to learn, then, and you're not getting it from the teacher, you raise your hand and try to get it. And that's what we all learned in American classrooms. Is that true? How many here have gone to an American public school? Okay. That was certainly true in my classroom back in the days when I rode to school on a dinosaur. And I'm sure it's just as true now. That, you got a question, you ask the question. So are Asian kids conservative? Yes. Asian kids tend to be conservative. Why? Because as we've discussed already, Asian kids are taught to be respectful. Don't confuse respect with submissiveness or conservativeness or not having any thoughts in your head. Because you do. Some people are conservative, some are not conservative. That has less to do with culture. And let me just mention two more things real quickly. There's an interesting concept in Japanese called hone and tatemai. The words are not important. But hone, but it's the way in which every person feels and expresses themselves and their own thoughts. And only the Japanese have specific words for it. Hone means one's true feelings, what we really think about something. Tatemai is what we publicly explain to people. And every single day, we're challenged with these ideas. What do we really think as opposed to what should we say instead? And that's a filter that we all have in this. Again, the words hone and tatemai are not important, but the concept of within ourselves knowing exactly what we really feel, but saying what we have to say about that same thing in order to maintain our relationships, in order to maintain a number of things to smooth our way through daily life. We do that every day without even thinking about it. Again, only the Japanese have given it a name, names. But everybody does it and every culture does it. And Danny and I talked about this early on after we met each other. And, you know, I don't have to give you examples of how you do it because you can give yourself tens, if not hundreds of examples of how you do it. What do you tell your parents versus what do you really think? What do you tell your friends versus what you really think? If you're trying to impress somebody, for whatever reason, you're going to tell them something even if you think something else. We do that all the time. And that's something that helps define us not as only as people, but as members of our culture. And probably, what else was I talking about? Oh, yeah. This whole concept of Asian values versus Western values is not new. And in fact, about 15, 16, 17, 18 years ago, it erupted into the public international discussion, coming originally from Singapore, of all places. There was a case in Singapore where a young American kid who was living there, his dad was a FedEx executive. You know, this kid was a real idiot. He gets some spray paint with his buddies, and they go spray painting cars along the street, and maybe keying, you know, some damage into the side of the car. And they got caught. Well, in this country, you're going to get a slap on the wrist, or you're going to have to go to juvenile court, and they're going to go like this to you, and it's not going to be fun, but it's not necessarily going to affect your the rest of your life. In Singapore, you get caned. You know what that means? They take a bamboo stick and they hit you. And this kid, this American kid, Michael Fay is his name, was caught, convicted, and sentenced to 10 lashes of the cane. Okay? And what they have, it's a special thing where you take your shirt off and you're tied to a post. And there's a guy who does this for a living. He takes a bamboo cane that's split at the end, like that, 10 times. That's in Singapore, and this kid was sentenced to this. And Americans in this country are crazy. What? This kid would never, you know, if this was here, and the Singaporean said, yeah, but he's not here. He's in Singapore, and he violated our laws, and these are our regulations, and these are our punishments, and okay, we'll reduce it to 5 lashes, but he's still going to get lashed. And you know who objected the most loudly? President Bill Clinton. And the Singaporeans got really upset with this. They said, well, wait a minute now, Mr. President, let me see if I understand this properly. It's okay for brown kids and yellow kids to get caned, but not white kids? Why is that exactly? And this became the beginning of an international discussion, not always conducted in a very civil manner, called Asian values versus Western values. It came out of Singapore, understandably. And one of Singapore's brightest thinkers, a guy named Kishore Mahbubani, who actually is an Indian. Singapore is a multiracial, multi-ethnic country, Chinese, Malay, and Indian. And Kishore was an Indian who, Singaporean, who spent a lot of time in the United States, and he basically said, look, one of the reasons why Asia is eating America's lunch around the world economically is because our values are stronger. You guys have loose values, you guys don't know what, you don't respect anything, you don't respect anybody, you're all a bunch of individualists who go off in your own different directions, and our values in Asia are stronger, and that's why our cultures and our economies are starting to wipe you guys, you know, we're wiping your butts with our success. And Americans kind of go, whoa, wait a minute. And this was played out in international journals, it was played out around the world in ways that if you were paying attention, this was one of the things that got your attention. And it became nasty. And it was started by this Michael Fay case. By the way, he got lashed 5 times, and then he got deported from the country. And when he went back home to Ohio, he still got in trouble. And the Singaporeans love to point that out. every time he gets picked up for DWI or something like that, it makes front page of the Singaporean newspapers, even 15 years later. But this argument of Asian values versus Western values was a serious discussion in the world. And the discussion went something like this. In Asia, our values promote family strength, family values, a stress on education, and a kind of society that offers hope and future to our young people. And you don't have that. You know, what you have is chaos and anarchy. And the Americans fought back and they said, well, you're wrong. Our values are the same as your values, and our society, the strengths of our society come from our values also. And this raged on for about 5 or 6 years. And finally it came to an uneasy end by both sides pretty much reluctantly agreeing that what the Asians called Asian values and what Americans called American values were really universal values. That people who grew up in families respect their families. People who grew up in societies respected their societies. People who went to school respected their teachers. And that's, again, an uneasy truce was negotiated between folks who are. But look it up. Look up Asian Values 1997. That's the argument. It's fascinating. So,
It's time for Q&A.
Time for Q&A.
Do you guys have any story you would like to share about culture's value?
Did this make any sense to you guys?
So I have a question for Jim. So I know that you've been working with a lot of Asians, and is there any memories, any significant memory that you still remember about having a misunderstanding, culture misunderstanding, and how do you resolve it?
Come to my house sometime. You'll see. Many, some big, some small, and I'll have to think about them a little bit. But
Think about your wife.
Yeah.
Is there any misunderstanding because of cultural values?
Oh, I think all the time, on both sides. Mostly often dealing with stereotypes. Americans think like this. Asians think like this. Vietnamese think like this. Why do Vietnamese always do that? Well, not all Vietnamese do that.
So in order to have a sustainable relationship, so what do you think is the most important qualification or the most important skills that one should have in order to interact and work with other people from different backgrounds?
I think try to understand as much, first of all, about yourself as you can in the broadest possible way, and then take the time, energy, and effort to try to understand those with whom you're doing business, with those with whom you are trying to establish a personal relationship. Whatever the nature of the relationship is, try to understand that person and that person's culture. Read, ask questions. Talk to other people from that same culture. Find out, try to understand that one person's view often is just that, one person's view. And that it will take time, energy, and effort to determine what it is that you're learning from that other person that everybody from that culture, most people from that culture think, as opposed to just that individual. Take time. Don't jump to conclusions. One of the people win gold medals every day at jumping to conclusions. We shouldn't do that.
So anyone have any questions?
So when you go travel for work in Korea, how do you find a common ground with, I guess, the people you have to work with there, if they're naturally going to call you Director Kelman?
No, the people that I work with there, first of all, we have a common interest and common goal. And that's always important. In any relationship, whether it's personal or professional, if you have common interests and common goals, and if you're working for the same kinds of things, that goes a long way bridging culture, whatever cultural differences. One of the things I notice the Koreans do every time that I'm there and that our small group is there, is that they will often, there will always be a meal, and it'll be a Korean meal, and it'll be something that then they are able to explain to us. It's a period where whatever, we've been working on is set aside for a moment and we eat together. That's actually important because foods are so unique and foods are so different, and foods really reflect culture. We saw a little bit of that earlier. That's a wonderful way to begin to bridge differences. Just having a meal together.
If so, like at school, when I have like group projects with people who don't talk very much but have good ideas, I was wondering, how do you get them to offer up what they're thinking?
It's not always easy. Sometimes you can ask for it in writing if they're really. Very often, people, especially whose English language skills are not native, are afraid to speak publicly or speak in front of others. Because again, the two biggest fears that we have in life for everybody are, number one, the fear of failure, and number two, the fear of rejection. And when you speak publicly and you're saying something, both of those fears come into play immediately. Are they going to think I'm stupid? Are they going to think that that I don't know what I'm talking about? Are they going to then reject what I'm suggesting and therefore me? And the two biggest fears that everybody has on any level are those two fears, the fear of failure and the fear of rejection. And so I think that these can be very strong driving forces in a negative way to prevent people from expressing what could be very valuable suggestions. So maybe one-on-one is a good way to deal with it. Maybe asking for something in writing is a way to do it. Maybe taking the time and effort to draw out of somebody what their thinking is. And this is something that Dave and others here are teaching all of us to do with each other. And those are very valuable skills that will have untold benefits as we march through life.
Is there any more questions?
I have a disclaimer. I say Jim just speaking from his point of view.
Yep.
He doesn't speak from the perspective of the mainstream because there are different perspectives coming from the white European culture. And so with that, I think it's important to the main thing is the flexibilities and perceptions are playing an important role in presenting the viewpoint that seem to be correct, but actually it may affect the way that you try to get the people in the project to work with you, because perhaps those people may have perceived you as an arrogant, maybe having to take it too seriously about the work, and sometimes they think the time, Americans tend to be more individualistic, so therefore they think they have the talent and skill set to be able to get things done without sharing, collaborating. Also another thing that you mentioned about collaborating, I think there's a different meaning in Asian. Collaboration from your viewpoint may not be the same meaning as collaboration from our viewpoint. So that's important because we collaborate, we work within the family, within the people whom we know. That doesn't mean that we want to collaborate with people outside our family. Really because of the distinction between what exactly the meaning of being respected to someone and there's different classes within one major class.
Many Americans, to build on what Dave just said, many Americans view collaboration as coming up, the outcome of which will be a specific direction, whereas many Asians will collaborate with the goal of consensus. It's a little bit different.
So any other questions? Okay, so I think, thank you, Jim, for coming here today because your opinion is very valuable. And sharing your point of view. So I hope that you guys have better understand about the difference between Asian and Western culture, and it will benefit you in terms of expressing yourself as well as perceiving your identity. Thank you, everyone.
Do you like a person who's mainstream, look like Jim, but maybe have a different perspective coming in and talk about this?
That would be fun.
It would be a different perspective than Jim for sure.
Yeah. Bring someone from like conservative, like Southern.
Okay, we'll bring someone because Jim is too nice.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm trying to say to you that many, so you kind of feel that I'm wanting to bring in a
Maybe
diverse.
bring someone in who doesn't have a lot of experience with Asians and Asian Americans.
Right.
Someone provocative.
Okay.
Yeah.
We'll do that. Is that the only Byron's point of view? Is you guys would like someone a little bit more, who's a little bit more
Is this a theme you'd like to develop with over the months?
I think it'd be interesting actually to see someone who was not mindful and kind of only had the American view. So
Okay, so that's not what, so you and Byron have a same viewpoint.
yeah.
I think like Jim is sort of just preaching to the choir, and I don't want to hear someone just reinforcing my opinion. I want to hear is like someone someone's trying to change my opinion, so I can someone to challenge my opinion rather, so that I can think of.
Good.
Yeah.
Hey, maybe I'm not the right guy for this. I spent my whole career trying to promote mutual understanding.
No, but Jim, yeah. Okay, I will do so. We'll bring a guy who is provocative.
Yeah.
But if I bring him in or her in, would you try to create mutual understanding and persuade that person somehow?
Yeah, it's gonna be kind
course it'll-
of offensive.
I mean, of course it'll be like civil and everything, but
Okay.
I just don't want someone reinforcing what I already think.
But
Okay.
read the Asian values debate of the 1990s, because that'll help you to frame maybe some.
You know, someone has said, I'm not gonna name it, culture, there's a definition from the white meaning. Culture is a full word, there's an acronym for cult. So they see some American think that Asian, when they hang out together in one group, is a cult. Is that provocative? Do you agree with it?
I mean, it really depends on how you define it.
Right, but a cult has a bad connotation.
Yeah, it does have a bad connotation, but
So
and if you think like self-segregation is bad, then it might go well to put the bad connotation with no bad.
Okay, so there might be viewpoints like that. Okay.
Okay.
Okay, good.
Thank you, everyone. Have an applause, and we can.
Anybody has any